Lord, I ask that your Spirit be with me now, that your presence guide my thoughts and guide my reflections, that we can hear your message of hope that we need to hear so desperately. I pray this in your holy name. Amen. Advent is this unusual, odd even, time of year. Robert mentioned at the beginning of the service that this is the beginning of the church year, that this is the first Sunday of the church year, and we begin with Advent. But outside of the church, Advent doesn't really exist. It's a unique space and time. In the secular world, right now, all the emphasis between now and Christmas is really in the retail world. It's in this period of time where most merchants make the majority of their income for the whole year, from Black Friday sales that actually started before Thanksgiving this year, all the way up to those last minute sales on Christmas items for gifts or for celebrating or for decorating. There's all this energy and emphasis on Christmas, and Christmas carols are playing, and we want to rush to Christmas. Maybe this year more so than any other time in my lifetime, because there has been such pain and challenges and difficulties and frustrations this particular year. We're hearing on the news every day the escalating number of cases that are growing with the pandemic. We hear about the stock market moving up and down. We hear about an election that's being contested. And we hear about fatigue. As experts are talking about this as this real thing, that people are just tired. And here we are moving into Advent and these dark, dark days, and we're tired, and we want to be able to celebrate. We want Christmas. We want all the bells and the sparkly lights and the beautifully wrapped gifts, and we want to gather people together. We want all of that stuff. But that's not Advent. Advent always begins with the prophets. It begins offering words of hope to people in painful times. And this year, as we hear from the prophet Isaiah, it's almost as if he is speaking to us today. The prophet Isaiah was speaking to a people whose world had collapsed. Jerusalem was burning, the temple had been destroyed, the people were scattered. They felt so lost. And he begins this chapter by crying out, "Oh, if only, Lord, if only you would just tear the heavens apart and come and be with us. If only you would be with us. We know that you have been there, and we know that there is no other God out there, anywhere, that has done what you have done. But we've forgotten how to pray. We've forgotten to make room for you in our lives. We've gotten so caught up with all the pain and the loss and the suffering and the anxiety and the fears that we feel far from you. We have closed ourselves off to you." Isaiah's words could be spoken to us nowadays. They are these words of people that are fatigued and worn out and frustrated and feeling so lost and far away from God's presence and God's ability to change the world and bring nations to their knees or rise them up out of the dust. If only, Isaiah says, if only you would just tear open the heavens and come to us. And then he ends this section with this incredible phrase, "But despite all that we are suffering, despite the fact that we have closed ourselves off from you, we have turned our backs on you, despite all of that, you are the potter and we are the clay. Now that can feel manipulative and forced, as if we have no free will, as if we have no voice, that God just randomly chooses to scoop us up and smash us into new shapes on a whim. But actually, this phrase is so intimate and loving and hope-filled. When a potter works with clay, they begin first by breaking off a chunk of the raw clay from a riverbank or nowadays a bucket of clay. And that clay is filled with tiny air pockets that must be worked out or it will explode when it goes into the kiln. It's filled with all sorts of organic impurities and an odd distribution of the metals and the minerals and the platelets that make up the clay. And when the potter first holds that clay in their hands, the clay is cold and stiff, unresisting, hard. And the first step for the potter to create a vessel out of the clay is something called wedging. It's physically demanding. It is hard work. It is breaking that clay down over and over and pounding into it. It makes your shoulders ache and your muscles ache and your fingers ache. This process pushes out all the tiny little air bubbles, the pockets of things that are trapped within. It spreads out all the impurities and unevenness. It lines up the platelets so that they can slide evenly across each other as opposed to banging into each other. And when that process is done, the potter is sore and exhausted. And the potter's hands are stiff, fingers ache, the skin is dry. And depending on how long the potter's been working with the clay, you can even start developing cracks in the dry skin of your hands because the warmth and the moisture, the oils of the skin of the hands, the warmth of the hands has been transferred into the clay. And what was once cold and stiff and resisting has become warm and moist and pliable. There's been an exchange, an interaction. God, as the potter, invests in us. God puts God's very self out for us in ways that can cause pain. And in that process, God helps break down those things that we hang on to, line us up so that we can be shaped and opened up, and fills us with God's very presence, making us soft and pliable. And then that next step, now that the clay is moist and soft and movable, is to center it on the wheel. You can't force that. If you try to take the clay and force it into the center, to the exact center, so you can begin shaping it, you'll be completely unsuccessful. It's almost as if the more you push it towards the center, the more it goes the other direction. It's a process of pulling the clay up and then pushing it down again and pulling it up as the wheel spins, and that process gradually moves in a spiraling kind of fashion until the clay is perfectly centered. It has to be centered before it can be shaped into what the potter envisions and to what the clay will lend itself to. If you don't, if it's not centered and you try to make a vase or a bowl or a cup, one wall will be thinner than the other, it will wobble, it will collapse in on itself, the sides will fold over, or it will flop over, or it will come completely off the wheel and go flying off, and you have to start completely over again. But once you're centered, the potter can begin opening up the middle. It's not enough to be centered. It's not like that's the goal of the piece of clay or the goal of the potter. The goal of the potter is to first center you so that you can then be shaped and opened up. And sometimes as the potter works with the clay, the beautiful vase that the potter imagines isn't what the clay is going to do. And the potter has to, once again, with hands on the clay and adding water as needed and having the clay spin and keeping it centered and focused and applying gentle pressure, allow the clay to help speak to what it can do as the potter lets it grow into the shape that it is meant to be. Oh, if only, Lord, you would tear apart the heavens and enter into this insane place. Come to us. But you are the potter, and we are the clay. And there is such hope in that, because it means your hands are upon us. You have torn open the heavens and come through the form of your Son, Jesus Christ, into our world. And what better Advent message is there for us today than to say, O come, Emmanuel. Amen.